right, welcome back to On Patrol. I am Fightin Kentuckian, and I'm here with my co-host,
Wyndehurst Productions.
We're excited for another quick, brand new episode of On Patrol. Today in episode 4, we expect to talk about terrain and two major points in quality and quantity on the tabletop. But before we pick up our spear, our shield, musket or belt-fed machine gun to go venture through the woods and hills of terrain, see what I did there? Let's talk about our follow-up section after each episode. Alibis, caveats, and piggybacks. And talking about these things, I just wanted to say I'm truly impressed with everybody's work on the Facebook group continuing to grow and looking at your progress reports on your projects. It's definitely keeping me motivated. Keep it up, and keep posting, and that'll, again, hold me accountable to finish these Romans that'll hopefully get finished one day. I'll hand it over here to Wyndehurst to talk about, additional alibis, caveats, and piggybacks. Wyndehurst?
Yeah, so I've got a piggyback off of what you said. So with the Facebook group, when we made it, our idea was it would be a venue for people to share knowledge with each other and grow the community as a whole, but also to be a platform for you all to reach out to us. And it feels like we've nailed that first one so far. But just to remind everybody, if you have ideas or feedback, good or bad, on our episodes, we'd love to hear from you on that. We'll try to post when we post each episode on there. Feel free to comment there. I've got a pinned post on there for suggestions on future episodes. So just a reminder, don't hesitate to use that site, that group, as a way to contact us with feedback for the podcast. An alibi from our last episode. So we did a whole episode on project management, on starting projects and not getting distracted, and on finishing them. And then I immediately rolled into, after that episode, like last week and a little bit the week before, into this Old West diversion. Now, I don't want it to seem like I'm a hypocrite not doing what I preach. So I wanted to make it clear that even on this small side project, I still was keeping in mind our SMART goal that we talked about. And if you didn't hear the last episode, I highly recommend going and listening to it because using those SMART goals allowed me to knock out these 10 models in about a week and get right back into my Normans. So even on your small diversionary projects, which are great to help break the monotony of big armies, it's important to use those SMART goals because they can very easily get out of hand, and either you don't finish the side ones, now you've got a dozen side projects, or they turn into major projects and you never get back in a reasonable time to the big ones. So I just wanted to touch on that. But yeah, that's it for me, Kentuckian. Why don't you take us on?
All right, so great stuff. We're super jealous that you were able to knock out a whole new period, in a week, and have the miniatures, and you got the rules. So that was great stuff. That was a hero moment there in the hobby. But again, let's refocus back onto our topic today is terrain and helping to kind of make the tabletop. Before we dive too much into this terrain, we wanted to talk about, the evolution of it for us in gaming. We all kind of came from 2D cardstock and books under felt mats on the kitchen table. The hand-carved, painstakingly painted, and extremely immersive battlefields on a massive, table, whatever that is. We hope to embark on the discussion and guiding thoughts on terrain, as we again continue on this discussion. But we at least wanted to give a tip of the cap here on where we've come from. So I'll hand it back to Wyndehurst for our start.
Yeah. So terrain we felt was a good topic. Kind of going with our theme here of what is historical wargaming, building communities and projects. The terrain you play with is an important part of the gaming experience, as much, I'd say equally as important as the miniatures you work on. But where do we start? So as Kentuckian said, it's kind of starting at the bottom. So if you've played with miniature war games, odds are you've probably used some type of terrain. Even a lot of board games these days will have some type of terrain, whether it be hexes or grids, 2D cardstock, cutouts of buildings, even 2D play mats representing interiors of things. Things you normally would see more in like a board game type environment, but you do see those in some board games, and maybe we just have to use those in our early wargaming experience. So we don't want to disparage those what you might call rudimentary elements of the hobby, because they still have value to many people. Sometimes that's all you have access to. And so both of us have used those. And Kentuckian, can you provide some examples of some of that kind of more rudimentary terrain that you've used?
Yeah, I think in my wargaming career, I started early with like a lot of the Avalon Hill games, which are they're a mesh between board games and tabletop, using the hexes and those things. And I think a lot of our war games, at least again early kind of stages, those rules are normally easier to wrap your head around, but dang, they can be very complex. But the immersion is not really there. I love those games. I still play them to this day. They're obviously a big part of the hobby, and they have a huge following. But when we're talking today for those examples, is when I wanted to get into immersion, those normally aren't the things that are gonna tick the bucket for me on immersion. What are some examples that you have, of the earlier hex-based or kind of rudimentary terrain games you've played?
Yeah, and I think for me, because a lot of my wargaming origin started way back with like Dungeons and Dragons and some early fantasy sci-fi stuff. So, I was very used to that, grid-based game where I'm just throwing stuff down on the table to represent this or that character or creature, and then slowly moving up to some cardboard ruins. And then there was an early game that I got into. I think it was called Mercs, kind of a near-future sci-fi, that had lovely models, great fun to paint. But the rules were really designed for that kind of 2D mats. And I found that it wasn't satisfying enough. All these game stores had all this great terrain, even for like 40K terrain. I was like, why can't I play it on that? But the mechanics just didn't really work well for it. And it was a struggle. But the developers of the game have since adapted the game to work very well with 3D. I think even they realized the potential of moving it to full like 3D. But I still have those mats, and like people saw on my Facebook page a while back when I did the Stargrave game, solo game, I used one of them because that's what I had. That was really the only way I could represent that environment. And while it wasn't my preferred way, it's the tool I had at the time, and so it's fine. If that's what you've got, it's fine. We're not here to say that those things are bad or you should feel bad using them. We just want to make a case for why we think there is a value to more terrain if it's appropriate for the game. So I think that's all really just to start us off. So Kentucky, why don't you take us into our next section?
So yeah, we think, again, just to pick up on Wyndehurst's point, we think terrain, can vary wildly on the gameplay, the period depicted, or the way it can be interacted with in the game. And so we wanted to break that down into a few categories. And specifically, there's two that we're going to look at today: quantity and quality. We're going to first go into quantity of terrain. And, this is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The kind of categories that we break up quantity into is too little, too much, and just right. And so we'll talk a little bit here in more detail about quality, but we kind of have those as, what we see as basic quality, tabletop standard, as well as the last one, top-notch, elite, or display quality. So shifting back to quantity of terrain, right? How much on your table? I first want to hit on too little. So most of us have played a game before where the tabletop seems like the Asian steps, right? Which it might be good if you're actually intended to be playing there on the Asian steps. However, if you're playing a game with, maybe automatic weapons or a rule set embedded in requiring an army, a tactical terrain advantage, this might not achieve the desired result. And therefore, the board can kind of turn into what some have called, a turkey shoot with little to no strategy, and the player on the disadvantaged side kind of clinging to their dice rolls. And so, again, this is the too little terrain. What do you have, Wyndehurst, as maybe an example of a game you've played or too little terrain?
Yeah, so for me, I have had some experiences where too little, not having enough stuff on the table, didn't meet the mechanics, really the rules, and so you found either one side or both sides not really having any viable strategic options, either to maneuver or do anything. It was like, well, you're just going to go straight at each other and smash each other's faces. And sometimes that can be the size of the table, not just the terrain itself, but the amount of space you give yourself to put up that terrain is just not enough. But I think more for me, too little really comes down to kind of what we'll talk about later in quality. I played a really big game of Oathmark that was really cool to get a whole bunch of models out on the table, but the terrain, while it was like a big rank and file game, the terrain just felt lacking. We were playing on the table surface itself, just kind of glossy green paint. Not all the terrain was fully painted, and it was just kind of haphazardly placed, and it almost felt empty. Not necessarily to the point where it would affect gameplay, but in that it's like, wow, this doesn't really feel like a war game. There's no immersion to it, and it felt like there was too little almost effort or detail put into it, and variety. So for me, that was a case of like too little. What about you?
Yeah, my example of too little, I think you make a great point kind of with the contrast there. We're going to talk about some wargaming ancients later on, but sometimes, you don't need a lot of terrain to have a one of those mass battles. But I think, as you correctly indicate, it can kind of take away if there's none at all. And even worse yet, it can go kind of contra to the rules. So one advice comes to mind is when I made a buddy of mine play on Jamie Hensley on an open airfield table. He'll never let me live down to this day. Now, in World War II, with long-ranging machine guns and you've got infantry kind of out in the open, that's just a recipe for disaster and can really take away from the game. Same could be true with games where there's no hills and there's no direct advantages of terrain. Now, not to say that sometimes these games like Ancients or massed kind of volley fire combat can't take that into account, but when there's not enough terrain on the table in quantity, it can definitely erode the game, and it can remove a lot of the strategy from the players. And so it's just hey, let's point and click and roll dice, which sometimes might be historically accurate for the game, but sometimes it can definitely degrade the experience. But I'll hand it over to you for our next kind of topic in quantity of terrain.
Yeah. So with I thought, though, something you said, another, and I think we'll get into it in just the right amount, but in too little, like those ancient battles, yeah, they might be big open areas, but were they rarely flat and fully barren? But another example of too little is there are rules out there that specify you really ought to have this amount of terrain. I mean, I've played rules it's like you shouldn't have more than 12 inches of linear open space. And so if you're not meeting those bare minimums in the rules, then the mechanics of the rules aren't going to really work well. And that's definitely a case of too little. But then there's an opposite to that, right? And even especially with rules like that might get you into the realm of too much. So sometimes the terrain can really bog down the game where it's not the intent of, what you're trying to capture. Like some historical battles, that was the problem the commanders faced, and maybe you want to create that. But if it's an unintentional side effect, then that's too much. A lot of us have played on games that were, your Stalingrad buildings where it's just too many buildings, too close together with too much rubble, or your deep forests, or in the colonial Northeast, or in the Pacific jungles where you've got so many trees and so much vegetation that even the mechanics break down, making the objectives of the game either not desirable to obtain or simply unattainable because you've kind of broken the game mechanics with the amount of terrain, or you've impeded the playability where it's like, man, it's so hard to get these guys in these woods here or there, and I'm just not going to do it anymore. Even though that would be the most tactical thing to do, or that would fit in the setting, you stop acting like a commander in that setting because the terrain there's just too much of it. It's negatively affecting it. So, yeah. Kentuckian, do you have any examples of what you think too much terrain looks like?
Yeah, I think you brought up a good one with Stalingrad. I think we've all played kind of urban combat fights, and those are, normally wonderful tables. And, I think as you're correctly pointing out, this isn't just the immersion aspect, or the tension that's caused with urban combat. Like, I think that's what the game master or the rules writer is trying to get at. But I think when you're talking about the application to the tabletop, maybe the GM has gone a few steps too far. Maybe, if it's turn 3 and you're not engaged with the enemy and the tension was supposed to be in the fighting rather than kind of patrolling, well, then we've messed up. I haven't been able to make it a foot into the board. That's where I think too much. And just like you said, when it takes away from tactical advantages because you lose a brigade, moving through these woods that you can't fit them in and stuff like that, you're just not going to do it. And unfortunately, those have been the kind of games that I've played in over the years at conventions. It's normally been the urban or densely wooded games where, I'm sure the game master had a good idea, but maybe it wasn't play tested correctly, or maybe, us as gamers probably just boloed it or screwed it up somehow. But it broke down and not in the right way. Not just, they were trying to get the tension of the densely terrain to affect us. No, we never got engaged, or we weren't able to. We're 2 hours into the game and there's not been the rifle fired, and we're streamlining, or we're playing the game how we should. So those are kind of my examples. What about yours for too much?
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, I've played games where there were so many buildings with interiors, which at initial thought was like, man, this is great. But it got to the point where I forgot I had units in buildings, because you want it to look good, so they move into the second story of this 3-story building, and you put the roof back on and the third story back on, and you've moved all your guys, and then a whole turn goes around. The enemy's forgotten you've got guys there. You've forgotten you got guys there. 3 turns later, man, didn't I have a unit on this flank? Where'd it go? I've gotten home from games where I've had terrain and found somebody else's model still in a building because they forgot and I forgot. And in my French and Indian war games, I've really tried to create forests, like the feel of those kind of primordial forests that were fought over in a lot of those battles. And I've run into the case where I've had too much trees, because that you can have too many trees on a base in which, like you said, you can't get models in there, or you have too many individually based trees where they're not very stable, and you go to move one model and you knock over a fourth of the forest. And it's like trying to find that balance can be really tricky. So yeah, I think too much. And I think when we get into quality, I think some people, they feel like when trying to hit that higher quality, they kind of cross over into too much, and you've almost ended up with a display that's not playable. Yeah, but those are some of the experience I've had.
Yeah, no, those are great points with the, like you said, display that's not playable is what comes to mind with too much, especially when it's good. And the last kind of topic on quantity is just right. And so it's the perfect amount of terrain is hard target to hit, but depending on the game, the desired result, and the possible play testing, it's very achievable. So again, when we're talking about that perfect terrain, it matters what you're playing. It matters the game. Are we trying to do Stalingrad? Are we trying to do the Asiatic steppes? And so that's going to be very key to what you want to see in your just right, the porridge. As we said earlier, with too much, too little, and just right. What are some examples for you, Wyndehurst, that you think are just right on terrain that you've played?
Yeah, so I played a game of, was it Raven's Feast with my village, the one I've been working on, and I really felt I had kind of nailed a good level of terrain that it felt like a village. It might not have had as many buildings as a historic village might have, especially a village with a church, but I felt, and other people playing felt, like that looked appropriate, and it was still playable. There was a few buildings, you could get inside of them, you could get between them. There were terrain features to navigate around. So I felt like it was a real good balance, and it fit well with the rules. But then, I think the just right amount isn't always a question of numbers, and we'll get kind of this in quality. But you and I played a Hail Caesar biblical set game with your collection, and I'm pretty sure you just had this kind of arid, textured, not quite desert mat, and you put a couple of little undulating hills underneath it and threw down some like lichen clumps on it, and it felt perfect. Like had it been just the flat mat you had, that would have felt like too little. But just adding that little bit of texture, the undulating hills and some stuff to break it up, that felt right for the setting. And so to me, that was just right because it was the right amount for the setting. And then I think also just right amount can really fit to the rules. So one of my real favorite games of Wings of War and Wings of Glory, World War II, World War I dogfighting. And the only terrain I usually ever use is I have a big mat that's pretty much like an aerial photo of some countryside in a city, but it helps set the scale of the plains. Whereas if I just use a green mat, the scale doesn't match up, so it doesn't feel right. That just feels like too little. The quality's not there. But just having, that mat, putting the extra effort in getting that mat, that is adding enough to feel like the right amount for the setting of that game. What about you?
Yeah, just a caveat again, like I say, off your point there. As far as the just right, I totally agree with you on the. I use cigar box battle mats for my Blood Red Skies and Victory at Seas games, and those give enough detail in the artist's effects on the mats where it's like, oh man, if you're taking a good picture of the planes, maybe tailing each other or something like that, you get the immersion where it normally would be hard to do with just two models on the tabletop. So again, not needing a whole village or anything like that, but the amount of terrain to just perfectly get you immersed in the game, where the game basically operates with the models themselves and doesn't really call for terrain, but still can get that level. Some other examples of just right, as I've played Devil's Den game at Historicon several years back, that was just perfect. The terrain, the detail was there. The models could move into it, and you could actually see, you kind of saw the combat advantage of the hills and the undulations. Like sometimes it's hard to see with smaller scale models. I believe that was a 28 millimeter game, so it was really, really awesome. Stalingrad, I've seen it played right before, whether the GM uses additional rules to add movement. If they're just kind of copy and pasting it from a different system like Flames of War, Bolt Action, to get you immersed. And depending on what scale they're fighting at, is this a platoon fight over a few buildings, or is this a company fight, or where are we going at? So that goes into the size of the board as well. I think skirmish games or grand tactical games, however you look at it, I think terrain can really, add that additional tension without taking away. Now, it is a finite balance. This is the difference in placing another hill somewhere else. But if you're GMing it, or if you're trying to set it up to make it fair, you want that tension. If you have 3 or 4 avenues on a board, you want that tension created to say, okay, which one is he going to come through? Or, hey, there's woods over here and there's, rough ground over here. Maybe a cavalry attack can come on this wing. It might take it an extra turn. Is that a risk I'm willing to assume as a commander? Those things really, in my mind, amplify the game. The only other, comment I'll add to this is sometimes when it's embedded in the rules, like you said, there's a lot of rules where terrain is embedded and the placement of it is embedded, and so obviously the game designer has gone to some kind of great lengths to make it, that way and to tie it in. I think one of the games that's coming to mind here recently is Age of Hannibal, where as part of the deployment, you can deploy these terrain cards, and you're leveraging, hey, I'm deploying a river here or a rolling hill here because I know how my army fights, and this is the kind of ground I would want to be set up on, while your opponent is doing the same thing until all the cards are placed. So those can really add to a game, but I think regardless of grand tactical scale or skirmish scale, I think giving that tension, allow where the rules allow for it, to make those decisions rather than just a point and click really amplifies the game and helps you get into those kind of mental gymnastics that are really fun in wargaming until you fail, and then just no matter what, blame the dice, right? but Wyndehurst, I'll hand it back over to you to talk about quality.
Yeah, I think something you said though, and we had talked about earlier before we started recording. You mentioned the importance of, especially when you're a game organizer. And so, a lot of what we talk about is building this community. And, to me, the just right amount fits with the rules and the mechanics of the rules. But it really depends also the setting you're setting up. If Kentucky and I are setting up a fun game for ourselves, we don't care about the map being balanced. We want the right amount to terrain for us feels appropriate to the setting, and that might mean one side is at a disadvantage or an advantage, because we like to wargame that way, that kind of historical aspect of, man, war's not fair. But if you're an event organizer, you really got to consider that the right amount of terrain is going to give a fair, enjoyable experience for both players. Not too little that they don't have any options, but not so much that you're restricting or overloading them, trying to find that balance. And sometimes you might have to sacrifice realism in your setup in order to kind of get that balance. I know that I've played at least 2 of your tournaments, Kentuckian, and I feel like you've done a fairly good job. Most of the tables all the tables I played on, and most of the other ones I looked at, you had a good balance, and this felt like a realistic setup with the right amount of terrain. And I feel like that's the hardest balance as an event organizer. That if that's what you're here to listen for, is how can we help you in terrain and events? That's the trick, is finding that balance. Do you have anything you want to say about that real quick, since I know that's something you do a lot?
No. I just agree with you on just right. We kind of mentioned it, but we never went into too much detail on the historical refights. Those are great. I think me and you love playing the historical refights and knowing, maybe I can last a turn longer than the actual general or anything if I've got both arms tied behind my back. But sometimes, if you're playing a pickup game or something like that and looking into the rules, both players want a decent chance of winning, keeping outside some one-sided historical refights. I think you bring up some just great points on the, getting it just right, and what does that mean? It can mean a lot of things in different games, but finding that in your rule set and in your table setup is going to be definitely crucial.
Yeah, and really that just takes, I think, practice with the rules. But so moving on, we've talked about quality, and so obviously, I think you've gotten the gist that we're not saying like, oh, we'll just get a whole bunch of wooden blocks and have the right number of wooden blocks to represent all the buildings, right? There is a quality aspect to this that we want to talk about, and we think that setting the scene can be described, this quality at least can be basic, tabletop standard, and your kind of top-notch elite. So kind of basic is kind of maybe those wooden blocks. We'll talk about those first. Tabletop might match more your tabletop standard of painting models, and your elite might match more of your display quality of painting models. So kind of keep that in your mind as we talk about these. But let's start off with basic. So this is type of terrain that really achieves a minimal aesthetic, if any at all, to allow some immersion, but very heavily relying on the player's imagination. And so kind of like these basic blocks. So Kentucky, do you have examples of that kind of real basic terrain that requires a lot of imagination you've had to deal with?
Yeah, I think my mind goes to what I played with kind of growing up, as well as what I've seen sometimes on Facebook pictures and internet pictures, are those green mats with masking tape roads. And I'm not throwing any shade at those things. I think those are great, but I think that's the basic kind of level when you're talking about pushing around painted minis that you have. Sometimes the trees are just toy trees that are repurposed, or the water is the felt cut blue water, kind of the basic stuff. There's flat colors. There might be kind of very generic buildings or anything else like that. Sometimes terrain or hills are not really integral as to the tabletop. They can be plug and play, and maybe they're off colors or things like that. A thing that I also kind of sit into a basic tabletop for me, and again, understand these are sliding standards, are neoprene mats. Sometimes I feel like, they've got great artistic detail, and they can have some good images on there, but in my mind, they're just you lay them on there, you don't get really the contours, which in my mind, again, there's some games where you don't really need the contours in there, but they're very static. And to me, I think most neoprene mats would be at a kind of a basic terrain example. What are examples for you, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, so for me, basic, I've seen at clubs experienced gamers who have played for decades longer than I have, playing on those, felt mats with just like, you know, green green cloth for the grass, slightly darker green cloth for the tree area, blue cloth for the rivers, and maybe a brown strip for roads. And they're quite happily playing on that, and that's fine. But I can also honestly say I've never looked over at one of those tables and thought, man, I wonder what game they're playing. That looks fun. So for me, basic terrain is stuff that doesn't draw me in. And I think it really does a hindrance to your wargaming community, because you might have a blast playing in it because your enjoyment level is all in your head. You're imagining everything. And I get that, having been a D&D player playing, on a grid map. But for me, wargaming is more than that. It's more than a board game, and I like that immersion. So it's the wood blocks, the plain cardboard buildings, which I use when I was early on playing. I've seen people recently posting like solo play games where they've got like their kids' wood blocks, and I get sometimes that's all you have, especially if you're playing games that have a vast variety of settings that's outside of what you have a collection of. So not to say that that's bad, or what we're going to say we're not saying it's low quality. We're saying it's the basic, maybe entry level. But yeah, that's been my experience. What I would say is basic level quality.
Yeah, with kind of getting to the next standard, we'll talk about the tabletop standard. So again, we've kind of gone from this basic, like we both said, to what is the one up from that, and we kind of see it as the tabletop standard. This is kind of the gold standard for what we see most tables in the hobby. The terrain is on par. It's a good combat. Phone cameraman can achieve a photo that allows for the player to get the perspective of the unit or model, fielded on the table. So immersion is there, as where we both said in our examples earlier, immersion's very little. It takes a lot of imagination. Immersion is starting to get here. It might lack in some areas on this tabletop standard, but it's we're getting there. This is why we're playing with miniatures. This is not why we're playing with chit counters and those things. What's an example for you, Wyndehurst, of that tabletop standard?
Yeah. So for me, the standard is if you're starting to use trees that you've maybe like railroad quality, not just toy trees, but now you're starting to maybe like buying some pre-made scenic rail trees, or you're making some trees, buildings that are fully painted and very clearly and easily represent what they're supposed to. And for me, really, that kind of tabletop standard is where you start to include the scatter terrain that draws you into the world that the set or the setting. It's not always stuff that is super relevant tactically to the battle. Sometimes it can be maybe in a skirmish level, but on your bigger games, having that little wagon and camp set next to the woods or the farmstead with a few outbuildings and livestock, they might not have any real relevance, and the quality of them is the same level of quality as the models you've painted. But to me, it's starting to add that immersion level that is taking it beyond that kind of basic. What about you?
My example of tabletop standard is yeah, I'm in line with you on there. The biggest thing that I see, and again, kind of keeping out naval games and air games, like I talked about, the mat kind of helps me achieve those things. I think the ground and contours is a big part of that immersion for me. Hills, undulations, trenches, and then kind of along with that is the water, trees, vegetation, and kind of looks natural. Buildings have some stuff going on with them. Those really help me kind of, okay, I've got to look down at my shoes to realize I'm not this commander on this table. Like, I need to start looking around and where are the trees, where are my avenues of approach, where are my kind of fields of fire. Those things really pop for me when you start talking about tabletop standard and the ebb and flow of that and able to achieve that. Really look for those things. I think those things are easily achievable, just like we said. Cigar box battle mat, in my mind, is those artistic designs on the mat where you can overlay them a few well-placed hills, and then you're there. You've got the contours, and it doesn't take too much lichen or a few model trees and everything, and then you really have a tabletop that's popping, in my mind. But I'll hand it back over to you, Wyndehurst, to take the last one in quality.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I think you're right. Things like contours in the land really make a difference, and I feel like you had nailed that in that biblical game. With no other terrain other than lichen and some hills. But taking it beyond that, so our top notch. So this terrain, breaks the mold. The amount of detail and expertise is unmatched. It looks extremely realistic, and honestly, you could argue that this is museum display quality stuff when you look at it. It's some of the setups you see at the big gaming conventions that it's like, I cannot believe the level of detail they have put into this. It's like that same quality as like the display quality of models, where you look at an individual model, it's like, wow, I'm looking at this up close, and it's like they got every detail that you would see in a person shrunk down to this size. So, Kentuckian, what examples do you have for you that's top-notch, elite, standard?
I think, an example of that for me is kind of each room when you're looking at a building or the face of it or the building itself is kind of a mini diorama. There's a lot going on it. It's definitely adding to the immersion, the rust, the level of detail, the weathering. Players spend a lot of time with their mouth open, when they're looking at this table. The terrain, in my mind, it's adding to the rules, it's adding to that, but it's also telling a story, of the battle or the battle to be fought over it, or where the advantages and key terrain is. And prospective players can kind of clearly denote the advantages and disadvantages to the area. So somebody who's even not played the rules that you've had and they're coming up to this game, but they understand, at a base principle, strategy and maybe some principles of war. They're not Clausewitz, but they've got some idea that, hey, don't charge the front of a cannon. They can see, based on your terrain, where the advantages are going to be, where the enemy's dug in, where those things are gonna make or break the game that they're about to play. And sometimes, kind of harken back to our early stuff about, quality here is a slope of a hill, being a 2D cutout where you put your base, and your unit on top of it. It's hard to tell that, hey, that's really going to make me pay based on these rule systems if you step up to it. But if you look out and you've got this rolling hill undulated and you have enemies stacked up behind it with a hardened wall or sandbags or something like that, you can easily tell and denote that. And that level is what's really kind of, that's the zenith for me, I think, in getting that level that's still playable. What about you, Wyndehurst?
Yeah, I think the last thing you said there, that's still playable, because really this top-notch quality is where it gets difficult not to have the too much in the quantity side. The level of, because for me, the top-notch, when I look at terrain, I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like you said, it's got, fully done interiors, like everyone's almost a little diorama. The scattered terrain on the outside, like you can feel like they took a photo almost and recreated it. Some stuff you might see in large scale model scenery or museum displays, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's playable. So it's, as I think in the scope we're talking about, finding that top notch elite terrain is hitting that mark and making it playable. So also building on what you said, like contours in the ground, I think for me, when I see terrain where it's all built into the board. So like a dream of mine is going to have, these big boards that are either modular or all integrated, where your rivers are set down in, you have sunken roads, things like that. Your fields and everything, forests are all can be integrated or moved around. Trenches are set down into the ground as opposed to modular stuff on top. Like, I think that's where you kind of hit that stride in this top-notch terrain that's still playable. And it's hard to beat. It's hard to get there. You almost have to put more effort in, or as much effort into that as you would do in doing a whole army, I think, to get there. But yeah, for me, that's really what takes it to that top notch.
And just to recap, so we talked a little bit about quantity and quality kind of controlling terrain on the tabletop. And we've gone through now, too much, too little, and just right in quantity. And then we've talked about, our base standard, our tabletop standard, and then our display quality top notch as far as the quality of terrain. We want to tie in here kind of a bonus section before we wrap all this up together on a bow in our last section and talk about assembling terrain, and what that collection looks like for you. we want to break that down a little bit too, just to make it a little bit more digestible. When we talk about terrain, you can have, in our mind, there's handmade terrain, there's store-bought and commissioned terrain, and then there's 3D printed terrain. So, Wyndehurst, when you're talking about terrain, what is handmade? What's that to you?
Yeah, so from my experience and what I've seen other people do, this is your more like from scratch kind of stuff as opposed to modifying other things. So this is taking foam core board or cardboard, your popsicle sticks, whatever it might be, and building the terrain that you envision in your head or that you've got references for. I think they have pros and cons, and we both have pros and cons. We can talk about them. So for handmade, for me, pros and cons is you have full artistic license for pro when you're making your terrain. You can make the exact size you want it to be. You can put all the openings, as much detail in as you envision it. So you have full control. But that kind of comes with two big cons. The first one being it's a whole skill set in of itself. It's kind of that traditional skill set that a lot of old wargamers talk about is making this stuff. That's hard. Sometimes you have to reach out to people and get taught how to do it. You can't just figure it out on your own. And it can be a big time sink. Because you've got to construct it all and then paint it. So, it's almost more work than doing time investment anyway than, painting up an army. What about you, Kentuckian, for homemade stuff? What do you think of it, and what pros and cons do you have?
I really am in awe at the people that are able to do it and bring it to life on a board. And there's a lot of terrain builders out there that you can look at that just nail it. And terrain is normally an escape from painting miniatures or things. It's kind of an add-on. But when I see a beautiful piece, or the famous building that people make, or the just natural stuff that people make out of matchsticks and everything else, I'm very impressed. That would be the zenith if I could do those things. The cons for me are I normally just don't have the time dedicated. It always comes down to painting, playing, or building, or doing something like that. And if I did painting and building my own terrain, I'd probably never play a game. So unfortunately, I build smaller pieces of terrain and that stuff, and normally never on the handmade kind of side of it. I'm always impressed with it, and always, admiring it and looking at people's skill. But it's something, I may one day try to venture out and do something. I had delusions of building my own Roman mile fort out of like shish kebab sticks and stuff. But I lost the inertia on that very quickly when I saw the amount of detail and work. I think somebody posted it on some of the ancient sites. One of the famous painters, Sasha, who did the Aventine elephant I mentioned before, he did a Roman mile fort, or I've seen one before, just that stick built, and it is beyond impressive. But yeah, something I maybe one day will go after, but unfortunately I think time is a big con for me right now to diving in with both feet. But we'll move on to the second category of assembling this terrain and building your terrain collection with store-bought and commissions. I think both of us have used commissioned terrain pieces to kind of add to our collection, whether it's been teddy bear fur mats or buildings, one-off buildings. So commissions are a great kind of benefit to the hobby. A quick pro and con of that is, speed, but price. So definitely it can hurt your wallet and money that you'd have buying armies. Now you got to buy a mat and add to the table or a building that could definitely affect the rest of your discretionary income into the hobby. As far as other store-bought stuff, MDF kits, resin casts, pre-painted, terrain. Those, in my mind, are the big moneymaker. I think most people will be very experienced with them. I think, coming from even the resin casts or, 15 and 20 millimeter, I used to play a lot with Hovel. Those are great. They're one-tip models, and it's just the ability for you to paint and be able to add to that. I know people will add, terrain and detail a little bit to MDF and resin cast to even make them more immersed in their table, add some flock or some static grass and stuff, and those are really can make a table pop with little effort. As far as MDF kits, I enjoy those a lot. I have a good time with them. I allow for the creativity that they can give you in them, especially with the fact that you can follow the directions and everything, and if not, you can still punch out a wall here and there, give them some battle damage, really go in different directions with colors that you've seen, kind of match them up historically. There's really the sky's the limit on most MDF kits. As far as pre-painted with foreground, I have a bunch in my collection. I think I've only assembled a handful. I know they're supposed to be quick and get to the table. The foreground ones that are pre-painted have given me a little bit extra headache with how much they require in the assembly, but I will eventually get them to the tabletop. And the cons on these are just sometimes the pre-painted can look almost like the terrain you buy offline, the eBay trees or something where they're almost toy-like and stuff. I've seen people hit them with a wash or do a little bit of dry brushing to kind of make them pop a little bit more. But all of those in store-bought and commissions, I think, can really add to a table and probably are the easiest way for most people to get to the table to pop immediately. What about you, Wyndehurst? What are your pros and cons with store-bought and commission?
Yeah, so for me, definitely pros, pretty much everything you said as well. I think a lot of MDF terrain, a big pro for it is its weight. It's relatively lightweight compared to, maybe stuff you might make yourself. It's weight versus durability. It's fairly durable for its weight. And you can put them up together pretty quick. Cons for MDF at least, actually kind of all building terrain is painting them can feel challenging, because if you're used to painting models, that doesn't necessarily translate to painting buildings. It's almost like a different skill set because you're painting something much bigger. Maybe if you're really experienced painting vehicles, then the switch over to buildings is quite a leap. But I mean, there's a lot of variety out there in those pre-bought stuff, which is great. I've really started liking the commission side as far as like the teddy bear mats, because it's nice being able to, at least who I've been going through, I get this vision in my head, and while I would love to make it myself, and I probably could with a little trial and error, I just know the amount of time it would take is, like you were saying with the handmade, it was time I couldn't afford to give up out of my hobby. So it was a huge bonus being able to reach out to somebody who I've seen their work and I know they do good work and be like, here's my vision, this is what I want. They're like, yeah, I can do it, here's the dollar amount, and then 3 months down the road I got it back and it was exactly what I envisioned. So for me that was a huge thing. Now finding good commission people, I've had bad experiences with commission people where they abandon the project. Luckily for me, they sent it back, but that can be hit and miss. That can be a con for commissions. You got to be careful because you're trusting basically another hobbyist out there that they're going to take your money and do the work they said they'll do at the quality they said they'll do it. So finding somebody who's good and does the work and the time they say they'll do it, they're golden. And I always like supporting the hobby and supporting small businesses in the hobby. So if you find those people, let us know on the page who's the good commission people, because I'm having a harder time finding some of them sometimes. So the last one we're going to talk about is this 3D printed. I've got a little bit more experience, I think, than this, because up until I moved to the UK, I had a 3D printer, FDM 3D printer. So I think FDM printers, they really shine when it comes to terrain, while the resin printers really shine coming to bringing models. And there's lots of files out there that there's almost more variety in files for buildings and terrain than there is in, I think, any other medium other than maybe making it yourself. But at the cost and skill point, it's unmatched, because there are a lot of people out there who can design files and you can learn how to design files and modify them yourself for your own use and print them, and print it at home. And you can just set it to print, either with the files you've designed or bought. So yeah, the rolls into pros and cons. Like a huge pro for me when I was doing it is I could literally, while I could make a lot of the things by hand or find an MDF, I could set something to print while I'm spending time with my family or working on models. And then, several hours down the line, I've got a piece of terrain ready to go, just needs to be painted, after you get past the initial upkeep. Now, as a con, there is an initial upkeep cost or investment. Buying that printer can seem a little expensive, a big chunk of your hobby finances. And there is a little bit of a skill curve learning how to use it. But once I had gotten past those, I kind of ran into a third con, which I was printing terrain at a far faster rate than I was able to get to and paint. So I ended up having like a backlog of stuff. Like I had to just stop printing anything, because I couldn't paint my armies and paint all the terrain I was printing at the rate that if I had been buying the terrain, being more selective because I'm spending money on, these pieces, I might be able to do. But yeah, I wanted to include 3D printing because I think it's an emerging thing that can, especially in the realm of terrain, really opens up a lot of possibilities just in the sheer variety. What about you, pros and cons and experiences with 3D terrain?
Yeah, I've had several people, to include you. I haven't bought into the 3D printer because, again, I know it's a learning curve. So I have people, and I'm more than happy to throw them a couple bucks here and there to buy resin just to get them to print me models. But I know, like, during COVID, when I had a lot of time to engage in terrain and building tables, I built that large factory, and asked you to print me up some additional things to kind of help modify that. I would say that was a little bit of a hybrid project that was kind of built from scratch, yet I had an outline. So I'd used the GameCraft miniatures, like 4 foot, I think, by 18 inches. I can't even remember what it was, but it's a large factory that takes up a majority of the table. And in order to kind of fill the table out and have the design on the inside work and kind of make sure that it fit to the scale rather than just build that stuff, I 3D printed or got friends to 3D print, staircases and other kind of items for the inside to really magnify that. I think that's additional, like a pro is for, wrecked vehicles and those things, or models that are kind of one-off, rather than, ruin a nice model and stuff like that. I know a lot of people use 3D prints. I do as well, to kind of help add to the table and get that. I think it's a very cheap way and effective way to get those things and really grow your table. I definitely, as far as terrain, I think 3D printing is there. It's at a golden age. I know it's just going to keep getting better, but the issues with FDM and those things, you can hide it with certain paints and primers and stuff. With miniatures, obviously, it's a little bit easier to tell if they're 3D printed or resin printed, and what is the structural soundness of that. With terrain, you've got a lot of good stuff there going. It's normally all the FDM and stuff that I've used is held up to a lot of wear and tear. So I'm a huge fan of it. The con would be, like you said, I think there's, more quantity out there than you'd ever need. And so that's probably, you could go down a rabbit hole of looking for different buildings and terrain types and stuff. So that would probably be an issue with it. And that just stacks up your queue more and more and more. But that would be my thoughts on the 3D printed terrain.
Yeah. One other con to add from my experience with 3D prints, for those who, we're giving you this list of sources and ideas, I ran in that 3D prints, especially the FDM ones, can be very heat sensitive. So if you live in an area that gets quite hot, I recommend not leaving 3D printed terrain in your car on a hot day, because thankfully I've gotten to it before it was irrevocably damaged, but I definitely pulled out a box that had been sitting in the car for the day with some terrain in it, and it had gotten soft. And if I had left it there much longer, it could have been ruined. And that was stuff I'd already painted. So that's something to keep in mind as a con. You don't really have that problem with MDF or a lot of homemade materials, but it's definitely something to consider with 3D printed stuff.
Yeah, those are all great points, and we're talking about that kind of last bonus section about assembling our own terrain collection. Our three big categories of what we see out there with handmade, store bought, and commissions, and then kind of ending it on one of the big things overtaking the hobby is 3D printed. The next section that we want to move into here is tying up all of our terrain talk. And I want to start first by saying, this is almost like the chicken and the egg theory on terrain, kind of what came first, the wonderful terrain piece or the miniatures to fight over it. I think it's going to be different for everyone. I think, that sweet spot is going to be where is the compromise. One of the things that comes to mind, here recently that's kind of stood out to me, and especially, a few days after or a day or two after Waterloo, the actual anniversary of the battle, is the La Haye Saint and Hougoumont. Those two parts of that battle that are just kind of etched in everybody's heads that follows Napoleonics. And you can see those on the Grand Tactical table. You can see those on the 28 millimeter game table. And how do those get immersion and playability need to combine? And if you look at those two, sites or those two little famous spots in the battle, and you look at them at the different scales, you'll kind of see what we're talking about with terrain and the interaction. The two kind of touchstones that we talked about a lot early on, whether you were talking about quality or quantity, is the immersion and playability. I think those are kind of our watchwords as we go through this terrain. And so both of those need to combine together to achieve the best results. And so here, when I've seen, and I embark on my journey in the epic Napoleonics, kind of redoing all of my Napoleon's battles stuff in 15 millimeter, I've seen a lot of people use like the smaller La Haye Saint Hougoumont farms to kind of get that recreation of the battle, but yet still get that immersion for what they would look like on the table. And then, maybe you have a stand or a model in there actually conducting the fight, but you're not, plugging loopholes. You're not pointing rifles out the walls. The French engineers are coming, but, maybe you're more worried about brigades and other units on the edge of the table or coming in at different angles, or there's a lot other stuff going on, even though that is a terrain piece and in the game. As far as the 28 millimeter game goes, sometimes that's the focal point of a 28 millimeter game is, we're not doing the entire Battle of Waterloo, we're just doing this assault on this farmhouse. And so that can be just as critical as the immersion and playability. Well, how many units can I fit in there? What does that look like? Does that, or do the rules account for that, and how do they affect it? And so we want to harken back to, historical battles, and those are fun to play. Both me and Wyndehurst love playing historical refights, and sometimes where, maybe if you're doing the refight, you're on the losing side, you might lose, your back's against the wall, but it still allows you the ability to get that kind of feel from the game. Those are all great to do. But if you're playing an average game or a game where you more than likely want both sides to have a somewhat fair advantage of winning or an even chance of winning, terrain is going to affect that a lot more than a historical order of battle or battlefield, where it's kind of, hey, you've already got it, you just need to recreate it. And so we think that when you look at all these different kind of aspects of the quality and quantity and terrain, and you kind of use those guiding lights on immersion and playability to navigate those, you should be able to achieve that. Don't be discouraged by anything. Just kind of go after, just like I said earlier, the chicken and the egg theory on terrain. What kind of came first? What are you looking to create on your battlefield, and how do you want to replicate that? It's probably going to be maybe impractical to do a 28 millimeter, grand tactical game with La Haye Saint or Hougoumont being a big integral part of it, right? Unless you're doing the refight like we've seen years ago. But even then, there's going to be issues with the playability of that and the other things that we have kind of mentioned that might be cons against it. So see what you're trying to achieve, and then hopefully, I think if you're like me and Wyndehurst, you're going to use that immersion and playability to kind of guide you in deciding and helping set up your table and getting that wow factor to hopefully bring more people in. Wyndehurst, what do you think about kind of tying up all of the terrain and the quality and quantity aspects of it?
Yeah, so, a big part of wargaming, especially historical wargaming, you're either doing pickup games or you're refighting something. We've talked about all this before, but it can get boring if you're doing a lot of pickup games and events. It can get boring if every fight's a straight up, even fight, and so your terrain, you're worried about. I need enough terrain to make it fair, and this is where terrain can really, I think, shines through in a war game, because it's a lot easier to do off balance scenarios where it's like, I'm significantly outnumbered, but I have to hold this village with a river crossing. So I clearly have the terrain advantage, but I'm maybe numerically outnumbered. So you can start having much more dynamic, much more realistic games, and you can have each player has different objectives other than just eliminate the enemy, and that's all facilitated by good terrain layout, the right amount of terrain. And really, the amount of terrain comes down to what's appropriate for the rules you're playing. Too little terrain is really, you don't have enough for the rules to work the way they're intended. Too much terrain is, it breaks the game to the point where you can't really play it. But the quality really comes to your personal enjoyment. And like we said, if your personal enjoyment stops at the felt mats, that's fine. But think, if you're trying to grow community, what, the eye candy, what draws people in? Does a pretty table draw people in, or a less pretty table? So that's something to keep in mind as far as, quality versus, sorry, I think my door alarm's gone off, but quality versus, quantity. And you really got to, what works for the rules and what works for you personally. And what you're trying to do. So if it's community building or if it's event running, maybe your quality needs to be up more. If it's just for you and a buddy, and the quality really is whatever floats your boat. But yeah, I think that's my thoughts.
The only thing I'll add to it before we move to our next section, I think, we've had a comment from Scott Anderson. A lot of people had talked about terrain, and I really think Scott's comment is timely and kind of hits it too. Is, a lot of people are so focused on the armies and the tabletop, that their terrain is an afterthought, and it can really, when you put terrain as an afterthought, it can definitely, if you're playing miniature war games and you're not on chip-based games anymore, you're looking for some level of immersion, and when you put terrain, it doesn't have to be at the forefront. Maybe it is if the battle is over a siege or a certain building. But when you put terrain up there towards the front, or at least give it some thought and kind of how is this going to play in the game and how is this going to work, like Scott is saying, I think that'll be a good guiding one too for immersion and playability. So a lot of great points. Really appreciate your comments, Wyndehurst, and I hopefully that gives our listeners some definitely thoughts on terrain, tying it up, quality versus quantity, and some, assembling in their terrain collection. But I'll let you take it away to the next section.
Yep, so our last two sections, like we want to do every episode. So the first one is kit bag. So kit bag section, if this is your first episode listening, just a refresher, this is where we talk about something, either a technique or a tool, or something in the hobby that the two of us feels really adds to our enjoyments, and either of playing or getting it done, making stuff. And it's something that we want to share with you, as that you can put in your kit bag and take with you. So it goes along with our subject today, but we decided to talk about teddy bear fur mats. Some of the first games I played with Wyndehurst were over teddy bear fur mats, because that's really adds a lot of detail. You can throw hills and stuff underneath them to give your texture. They lay very nicely, and they help hide the edges of terrain you're adding. So I find them to be really useful. So much so that my first commission was for the one that I did my Dark Age villages on, and I was so happy with that from War Sigil that I have commissioned a pair of mats that can go side by side, and hopefully I'll be getting here in the next month or so to show off. But I found it really especially when you are in an environment where you can't have those nice boards, like foam boards that you have stuff built into, which I think kind of takes you beyond that tabletop standard, that a lot of our dreams. I feel like this is a good way to hit that tabletop standard as far as the ground covering goes. And so, for me, a good company I recommend is War Sigil. What about you, Kentuckian?
Yeah, I think teddy bear fur mats, in the pick and kit bag this month are great. I think that, to kind of attack some of the knocks that people have on them first, well, my models don't stand up. If you're playing individual or skirmish-based games, sometimes the complaint I hear is that, the fur sticks out so much, so if they're on a hill, it stops the plastic model from sticking up. I haven't had too much of a problem with that, and I normally play with a vast majority of plastic models. Still have a lot of good metal armies in my collection, but majority of plastic. I've heard, about the lifespan of them, with latex and what makes the roads, and then the covering up of, the dirt. I've had mine for all of my mats for, over 5 years now, and they've all held up pretty well. Obviously there's cracks in some concrete. I've got a city mat. But heck, you know what? There's cracks in actual concrete. So nothing too crazy on those. I really think the immersion is easily done with teddy bear fur mat. And if the roads get you or something gets you, doesn't mean, a simple mat, low cut teddy bear fur to just take away from that turf, or that golf putting green or something that I've seen a lot on tables in the past is it can definitely add to, your immersion in the game pretty substantially. And, hey, put rivers and roads on after the fact and bunch up the teddy bear fur to add to the immersion. But I really just agree with you. And while we're talking terrain, I think it's a quick fix. A lot of the ones out there I've seen are pretty reasonably priced, so they can get you there. Obviously, a little bit more than a drop cloth mat or those things, but yeah, I think a good fix for a table in a short amount of time would be a teddy bear fur mat for that. I guess I don't play with teddy bear fur completely. I still, I'm a huge cigar box battle mat fan, and those, drop cloths and everything. But I definitely see their benefit and their adding, to the immersion. We'll move on here from the kit bag, and we'll go over to scouting report. And just like Wyndehurst had said, scouting report is kind of us looking out into the near term and the far term on our hobby. And so that can be anything from, games played, what's going to happen here in the next few weeks, and what we're looking to in our goals to hopefully keep us accountable. So first up, my Roman Legion is almost done, but I believe I have hit the red line, right? I've heard when you're talking about running, runners have like this red line where if you stay just below it, you can stay at that pace forever, right? You can stay at that pace for a long time. You're hitting your endurance. You're getting your second wind. If you go above it and you increase and you just add a few more steps or a sprint in there, then you're not going to be able to maintain that. Your red line, you're going to fall off. So last month I was finishing 3 maniples and knocking them out, Hastati and 1 Principe or Princep, and just cooking. And I said, okay, I'm going to get these legionnaires done before the end of June. And I did my 4 last maniples of heavy infantry, and lo and behold, I redlined. It is a slog now to paint 72 spears in a row, to paint 144 pairs of sandals, right, or 144 sandals and scabbards and stuff. So I enjoy batch painting. I think it's a good way to finish an army, but I'm really fighting through the amount that I've kind of bitten off here on the last one. So I'm going to stay the course. Wyndehurst is keeping me accountable, and we'll definitely make sure I can get this army done, hopefully before the end of June, or a good bit of it done. Only have the cav left or something would be great. So that's where I stand. Yeah, that's where I stand on my Roman project. The Normandy campaign here at the local store, Guild Vault Games in Clarksville, Tennessee. We've launched a Normandy campaign. Buddy Nick's kind of spearheading it. It's turning out to be a really great game. Got about 8 to 10 players. linked games of bolt action. Really, really good time. Look forward to seeing where we go with that campaign. We're basically mixing a board game for tactical movement, and then we're going to fight when we run into each other on the tabletop. He's written some rules for reinforcements and reserves, and it's all well facing it's turning into a good time. So even though my Fallschirmjäger got slaughtered in the first turn, it's still a great game. Played a few games of Victory at Seas here recently. Really loving that game, especially I'm not a huge fan normally of naval combat. Like I said, I'm a ground pounder, so that stuff just perplexes me being on a boat. But really enjoying how the nuances to that game and the simplicity, but still giving you the feel of World War II Pacific naval combat. So look forward to more games of that and getting some more carriers and airplanes involved. Here, my kind of last thing on my scouting report is I've met an author here who lives in Clarksville, Mr. Daniel Peterson. He is author of several famous books and just lives a hop and a skip down from the wargaming store where we game at. And he's just a great resource for ancients wargaming. The book he wrote was The Roman Legions, and in color photographs, and you can find it kind of on Amazon and those things. He's real big into living history. Me and him have kind of already we met up the other night during the campaign, and we're looking forward to gaming maybe some Hail Caesar and some other things that he's fond of. But really look forward to gaming with that author and learning more from him, and especially about the books he's written. But yeah, all in all, looking forward to July, finishing June here strong, July, and then unfortunately, it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to attend NashCon. Looks like I'm going to be in the field living in a tent for a month, but things may change, so more to follow on that. But if you're going to NashCon, drink a beer for me. But Wyndehurst, I'll give it over to you for your scouting report.
Yep, thanks, man. And just so to let people know, July, we should get an episode out, but after that, because you're going to the field after July, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
So we might try, if we can make it work with our schedules, to get 2 episodes recorded so we can have a July one and an August one, but just keep in mind, we're both full-time active duty military, so we don't control our own lives, surprise, surprise. But we want to try and do this every month, so we'll do our best. So you should definitely have a July episode, and we'll see about the month after that. But for me individually, so this coming weekend, I was invited by a local venue to participate in a trial big game of Battle Group in 28 mil on huge, massive tables. It's at Big Battles in Cirencester, UK. Where I've taken my boys. I've done some games before, and I was very excited to be invited to do this trial game. And I played Battle Group once before with Kentuckian, but I think we did 10 mil. Was it 10?
15.
So it'll be interesting going up to 28, but pretty much their solution was just really big tables. And they've got the space and the terrain to do it. So that'll be cool. Next week I'm moving house, so I don't know if I'll get a lot of hobby stuff done pretty much after this week to the end of the month, because I'll be busy all weekend and prepping to move and then moving, getting set up. But hopefully by 2 weekends from now, I'll have photos of new hobby area set up and back working on stuff. I had my short diversion into Old West, and I'm already back on the Normans, was working on casualties today, and hopefully have those done here in the next day or so. And then I've got just finishing up all the Norman infantry to really kind of get a feel for how much I have. I've been toying with how big I want my units to be for these Dark Age armies, because if I go a little bit smaller, instead of like 8 across, I do like 6 across, I can like almost double the number of units I have just by reconsolidating all those extra figures. But I'll probably be posting on the group asking for people's feedback on that with some picture reference. So keep an eye out for that. I appreciate everyone's feedback on things. But yeah, that's what's in the near and far for me. Can I get any final thoughts? Sorry, I sent this.
No, I really appreciated the episode with Terrain. I'm glad we kind of put our heads together and thought this was the natural kind of progression of what we've talked about. I really look forward to people's feedback. I know we haven't hit, there's a lot of depth to terrain, and a lot of people are out there doing it really great. Just look on our site with Andreas and the stuff he's posted on his Stalingrad table, and just look for your feedback. And when you're setting up tables and how you plan to make them, where's your sweet spot in immersion and playability? And as Wyndehurst said, comment on there, give us the feedback, give us the caveats, the piggybacks, and the alibis, and look forward to the next one.
Yep. So again, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us on this episode of On Patrol. So, as always, grab your spear and shield, your musket or belt-fed machine gun, and join us on the next On Patrol. Dismiss.